Well, I'm having a busy day in my anti-Mormonism here today. First, we did the Dan Vogel stuff, and now here we are with the three Mormons. And this one's particularly insidious, so I think that this should be interesting. Actually, I've already watched it once, so they've got an ex-Mormon who's reconverted, and he was a lawyer. We know what God thinks of lawyers from the Book of Mormon. It is a little funny because he beats up on Kwaku a lot, and that's just enough to make it worthwhile in and of itself. But there's some pretty pretty crafty techniques used here that many people can be caught by. Everybody likes a good story, and this is going to be faith promoting unless you're alert to how they manipulate the conversation. So let's get into it.
We've got Dusty Smith on the show, and Dusty's story has been shared on LDS Living and things like that. All over the internet, honestly. Because, Dusty, you used to be a Mormon, and then an anti-Mormon, and now you're Mormon again.
Yes, I read the story.
You are a Mormon sandwich.
Sort of like that.
With like a real saucy kind of edgy middle.
There is a saucy part.
Yeah.
Actually,
Saucy,
I grew up non-LDS. I converted when I was right after college and served a mission. After my mission is when I left the church. I was in law school, actually. It was my third year of law school when I left the church.
And did you go inactive or did you leave the church?
Oh, no. I actually, I lost my testimony totally, and I was angry, very angry, and I wrote a letter to to my stake president and said, please remove my name from the church rolls. So yeah, that's as leaving as you can get. And then I got a letter a couple of months later inviting me to church court. I said, not going. Y'all don't have any authority over me. I've already rejected you. I didn't go. Then I got another letter about a month later saying that I've been excommunicated.
Oh, man.
Yeah, that didn't help with the anger issues.
Well, I mean, you asked for it.
I did. Yeah, I did. I always felt like they could have just said, "Okay, your name's off," but they went through the whole, ordeal of a court and that
disciplinary court.
Yeah, and that really
interesting. You were just kind of done.
Yeah, I was done. Really, and now I was even more done. I was overdone.
Yeah.
But yeah, I left the church in '89, my third year of law school.
Gotcha. Where'd you go to law school?
I went to Thomas Cooley Law School in Michigan.
Oh, cool.
It was the only law school I could find that would let me work full time.
Yeah.
Most schools, law schools, because law school is very, very strenuous, and the law schools will not let you work full time, especially your first year. But I carried a full time job all 3 years.
What was the crux of losing your testimony? What was it that put you over the edge? Because I think lots of people could relate with your story.
Well, when I was in law school in Michigan, I would go to Palmyra every now and then, right? And I happened to go, my last year of law school was during the pageant. And I went to the pageant, and there were just tons of anti-Mormons. And I argued with them, because I'm in law school, I can argue with anybody.
Yeah, right.
I took that Arguing 101 class. And
or the devil's advocate.
Heavy on the devil part, but yeah.
I hadn't finished law school yet, so maybe not the advocate.
I haven't passed the bar yet, but I came back wanting to be the smartest Mormon ever.
Yeah.
So that I...
Well, if a smart lawyer or law student can get taken down by anti-Mormons, then they must be pretty dangerous. It was the anti-Mormons that got to them. That's what they want us to take away from that now, isn't it?
Could better argue against anti-Mormons. So I came...
Okay, so he wanted to come back and be a junior apologist, right? But we'll find out that only leads him down the pathway into Satan's clutches. We don't want to do that. We just need to just run away when we hear anything about anti-Mormon, because no matter how smart you are, they can bring you down. Does that sound like what we're learning here? Oh, and he was angry. He can leave the church, but he can't leave it alone. Oh, we haven't gotten that far yet, though, have we? They're weaving in a lot of things here very carefully. I gotta admit, they're good at what they do.
Back and I began to read stuff, and the more I read, the more I thought, I was never taught this. I was never taught this. And to be perfectly honest, because I was imperfectly honest before now, but to be perfectly honest, I wasn't prepared for a spiritual battle. I was living on 3 hours of sleep a night, working all day, going to school, studying all night, trying to grab 3 hours of sleep here and there, and wasn't prepared for the spiritual battle that I was going to undergo. And I woke up one day and realized that I no longer believed. I no longer had a testimony.
Man. And when you no longer had a testimony, that you didn't just become neutral. You weren't just like, all right, well, I'll just live my life. You were
not
like,
my style.
Yeah, you're like,
not my style.
You're taking your arguing and you're going to go against the church.
When you're in court, you're not like, well, he could be guilty. Yeah, he could be not be.
Since I'm unsure, I'm going to just sit down now. No, I became not even a little anti. I was anti, to the infinite degree. I taught classes in churches against the Mormon Church.
But you were that guy. Like, when I was a Methodist, they brought in a man who was also bald, and he told us about,
at this time,
you were much younger then.
I was better looking, too.
You were much younger then. No, I taught classes. I wrote stuff. Then I found the internet when I got out. When I came back from after.
So he mentions he wasn't prepared for a spiritual battle because he had 3 hours of sleep. How does the Holy Ghost come in here? Shouldn't he have discernment by the gift of the Holy Ghost if he is still righteously keeping the commandments of God, and he's trying to study things so that he can defend the church, but he woke up and found out he'd lost his testimony? Okay. I just want to see if we've got some contradictions here. We're going to have some pretty stark contradictions as we go along here with what we've been told about the gospel and living it versus the results that he gets.
After law school, I was in the Army.
Okay.
And I was stationed in Panama and Honduras. And which is interesting that I was stationed in Honduras because I served my mission in Honduras. So I actually went to people that I had taught and apologized for teaching lies.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. When you say anti, I was...
You weren't like a little letter online trolling people on Twitter. You were like the real deal. You had some guts.
Twitter would never work for me. You're limited to 140 characters. Then I found the internet when I came back to the States, and I looked for bulletin boards that were LDS bulletin boards. I wanted to argue with people, and I did. I went and found several, and I was constantly posting, you guys are wrong, you guys are wrong, you guys are wrong, here's why you're wrong, it's a false church, it's a false prophet. You name it, I was spouting it.
Hold on. So do you think that when you made your decision that cognitive dissonance fell in and you were like, well, I made my decision, so now I have to go deep into anti, or did you truly feel like there was no other option than to go anti?
Okay, so cognitive dissonance is being worked the other way in this case to validate his anti-Mormon position. I noticed that he's been very general, and he said, I didn't learn this, I didn't learn that, but he doesn't articulate really any points very well, at least during the whole course of this video that I've seen, except for the ones that he obfuscates with the first vision, that show the stark contradictions that we would find if we truly study the major issues here, where Jesus lies in the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, breaks his marriage covenants, and somehow they just manage to avoid the real issues here throughout, almost 30 minutes of this banter. Although he does discuss some specifics later on. Anyway.
There's always an option, but here's the thing that I don't think that people, if you've left the church, you understand this. If you leave the Baptist church, if you leave the Methodist church, if you leave the Lutheran church, you haven't invested much in those things. A lot of people choose their Baptist church, Lutheran church, Methodist church, one who has the best sermon. They like this choir. Yeah, the best congregation. They don't invest. When you become LDS, you invest in yourself into it. I was a college graduate when I became LDS the first time. I quit my job to go on a mission. Okay, I had family that turned their back on me. I had a girlfriend who turned her back on me. I gave up quite a bit to be LDS, and so when you leave that, you feel like you've been cheated.
Or betrayed, yeah.
Absolutely. So it wasn't just it wasn't just ambivalence in my. Now, I will say this: there are a lot of people who leave the LDS Church and become atheists, and I never did that. I always believed in God.
Interesting.
Okay, always believed in God. But yeah, holy moly, I was out there. I began to then search out places where I could.
He was out there. So basically, out there usually refers to being someone who is not really mentally judging things wisely. So he's denigrating people already that have discovered things evidently a little more articulately than he did.
Argue with people. I wanted people to know that I was against the Mormon Church and that they were all wrong, and I was right. And that's how I met Mike. In the story, Mike was on this, what do Mormons really believe? I joined and said, I'll tell you what they really believe. And he and I began to argue quite a bit. Some really nasty arguments.
Interesting, yeah. We've been a part of those a little bit.
I can see that with him. I can.
Yeah.
You're probably always right, though, so you just hold that inside.
That's kind of the branding of the show.
Yeah,
it's based upon that.
I didn't know that for a fact, but I suspected it.
I had no idea that I had no idea that Bruce Willis had such a punch to him.
Interestingly enough,
I
get stopped all the time. You look like I took a picture of me by a poster of his one day because people kept saying that. And darned if I don't a little bit. I don't get his money, but
maybe his strength.
But on the positive side, I didn't have to be with him anymore either. So,
you're in these arguments with Mike, and they're nasty.
Nasty,
and they're just not probably very edifying, or they're not really conducting any sort of good outcome.
Yeah. No, in fact, people watched them because they were arguments in.
So arguments aren't worthwhile, and it's better just to ignore people that realize that there is a contradiction within the LDS theology. We should just ignore them because contention is of the devil, and it's not going to lead us to anything good. Is that something we've heard? Turn away, don't listen, just follow the brethren. They know the way.
Posts where I would say something and he would say something, somebody else would join in. Yeah, this was a chat board where people would post on it'd be different threads. You could go, and I would start threads. Look at what Joseph did here. Look at what this happened here. And
was this just a couple of things, or was it like Joseph polygamy, blacks in the priesthood, women in the priesthood, Heavenly Mother?
Do you want to know one of the?
So how many people do we hear that they quit the church because of women in the priesthood? There are a few girls that got excommunicated saying that they felt they should have the priesthood, but is he really bringing up an issue that sends a lot of people out of the church? Did he say Heavenly Mother or something? I mean, blacks in the priesthood? We know that they've tainted that issue so much. I don't hear them wanting to approach the more difficult issues here.
The biggest arguments that I used against was all the various versions of the first vision. Because I would tell people on the board, you put a witness on the stand. I mean, I'm a litigator, right? You put a witness on the stand, and I have won more trials than I can shake a stick at by them having more than one story. 2 stories. I can destroy a witness with 2 stories. And Joseph has
9, he's going to say. And so why is that different? Well, on a witness stand, you're sworn to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. But here, we're going to bend the rules a little bit, for him even, as a lawyer, and where we find him rationalizing how he can be just like Joseph Smith. Or in other words, it's okay for Joseph Smith to change his story because he does it. And, of course, when he does it, he's not abiding by those rules of tell the whole truth.
9. Yeah. I can destroy his story. I could destroy Joseph on the way. And I would tell that to Mike.
Yeah.
That was one of my biggest arguments. The archaeology was another one. I can walk the streets of Jerusalem, but I can't walk the streets of Zarahemla. So.
Let's go back to that 9 versions of the first vision. What we know about the church's take on that, or what the apologists do, is that they say that Joseph Smith was merely emphasizing different aspects of the same story. Well, that's not the case, though. If we read them, what we discover is that he actually contradicted himself, and he did it multiple times blatantly, and that's what's not okay. So he's going to avoid talking about that. He's just going to go with, emphasizing or maybe leaving out some aspects, but we have stark contrast and contradiction We have Joseph Smith stating that he's 14 years old. And we have Joseph Smith stating that he's 15. We have him stating, I believe, that he's 16. We have him stating that his purpose was, to find out if the church was true, or what church was true, whereas we have him going in fully knowing that no church was true in another version. We have God the Father not even mentioned. So he just forgot to mention that, the most important person in the universe, apparently, by Christian standards, he just kind of forgot to mention that he was there. I mean, either he was 14 or he was 16 or he was, it's ridiculous. Either he went there to find out, which church he should join, or he already knew. He contradicts himself. He doesn't just emphasize something. And this guy, as a litigator, knows the difference. So it appears to me that he's chosen to disregard some of these things. When we see somebody who's left the church talking about many of the issues that caused them to come to the conclusion that the church could not be guided by an honest, all-knowing God, unchanging, they are careful in many instances to delineate exactly what those issues are and why they are problematic. But we notice this guy really doesn't do that. He avoids the most important aspects, which are the contradictions.
This was one of my other arguments.
Yeah.
So Mike and I, over time, became friends. And the hatred went away of the church. And I began to feel a pull. Back in 2005-ish, began to feel a pull. And rejected it. I said, it's just good feelings of my mission, because I really love my mission. Even when I was hating on the church, I would say that my mission was my best 2 years of my life.
Like, I had some fun times.
I love being a missionary. In Honduras.
Yeah. Not in Boise.
No, not in Boise. I probably wouldn't have had fun in Boise. But I did. I loved being a missionary. So I kind of rejected it. And in 2009, the pull came back a little bit. And that's where the miracle started, was in 2000. What precipitated some of the miracles was in 2009. In 2009, I went down to the Mexican border to do depositions. I had a client who was from Mexico and had been in a car accident in Dallas, and I went down to do depositions. He couldn't come back in the country, so we just arranged to do the depositions at the immigration station there on the border, in Laredo. So I go down to the border and I contract the swine flu.
I had the swine flu in 2009. H1N1.
Did you really?
I did.
I had the real bad kind of
You were much younger then.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, I came back and I was so sick, and I called. I'm a veteran, 6 knee surgeries. They consider me a disabled vet. So I called the VA. They said, "Oh no, don't come here." Nobody would see me.
Yeah.
They were afraid of it.
I remember.
And my 2 missionaries knocked on my door. My son let them in, and they came up, and I didn't want them there. And they said, "Well, can we give you a blessing?" And I said, "Okay." And they did. And I was immediately healed. Immediately. I mean, I got up out of bed, walked them downstairs, and still did not join the church. My pride was way too... they said I was going to... Well, no.
Have a good day.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the healing. Come again. I'll claim it. I'm sick.
Maybe not, actually.
Well, I went back. I went back to Sacrament. I went to talk to the stake president. He said, you'd have to go to a church court to come back. I said, well, I do anything wrong. I'm not going to a church court. I said, forget it. I walked away. Well, in 2009, I did.
So what's the message we're getting here? God is long-suffering and kind and blesses him by healing him immediately, and yet he's so hard-hearted that it takes him more experiences, multiple miracles, showing the tenderness and kindness of God to bring him back into the fold, but eventually God nurtures him back into the fold. And so, just like when Joseph Smith is using magic to channel the Book of Mormon on a brown rock, we're supposed to believe, well, anything that is correct or, a blessing, it comes from God. It has to be from the Israelite God if there's a miracle. It can't be from any other source that's misleading us into something that's not true. That's the assumption that we get, even though we find people have testimonies and spiritual experiences, like with the Book of Mormon, when the Book of Mormon contradicts itself in other LDS scripture. So the Spirit is effectively testifying to something that is, by definition, lying. Yet, we assume, okay, it's holy, it's good, it's from God because it feels good, or it accomplished what I wanted, it felt good, etc. And so, just like with Hugh Nibley saying that, well, if you can't figure out how Joseph Smith did this, I mean, he was a lad who was not very educated. Well, if there's any miracle involved, it must be this God of Israel who's doing it. That just means it's good, it's right, and it's true. Despite, no matter what God does, murder other people, have his Moses murder people, it's all justified because God is so good. Even though everything we read about God in the Old Testament tells us that he's really not a very good and loving and merciful God.
Joined another Mormon board under a name. I forget what name it was.
Yeah. Something like that. Like an old apostle or something. Usually they did that.
And I told him I was being pulled. I felt the pull.
Yeah.
Then I immediately left the board and never went back. Forgot I'd been on that board.
Yeah.
In 2014, I rejoined that board under a name Country Boy. And
you don't say.
Yeah. And I began posting, and this girl starts messaging me. Her name was Garden Girl. And she said, I feel very, very strangely drawn to you.
And then George Strait was like, come to the church.
I'm a country boy. She's a gardener girl.
You probably should stick to just So
let us be funny on this show.
So anyway, I told her, I said,
I'd just like to say that I don't know who it is you appeal to, Kwaku, but I really don't generally find you funny. And it seems to be one of the things that you think is one of the plus items for your show, and I find your antics actually idiotic. So I just thought I'd mention that.
I got to tell you, I don't mind messaging you, but I'm married. And she wrote back and she says, I'm 75, get over yourself. So
She just gardens.
yeah, she just gardens.
Yeah.
So anyway, we got talking on the phone one day. She was LDS, and I was never going to come back to the church. We were talking, and she said, "Do you have any family members in the church?" I said, "No." I said, "Oh, I do. Hang on, I do. I never met him, but he's a big mucky muck. His name is Dean Jesse. He is a church historian. In fact, if you've read the Joseph Smith papers,
Yeah.
you can thank him for that.
Yeah, nice.
But I never met him.
Yeah.
Okay, but I knew that of his existence because my mother did family tree work." And she was a long pause, and she said, "Your cousin is Dean Jesse?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "My cousin is Dean Jesse." Turns out this woman and I are related, and never knew she existed.
Amazing. And there was probably Mormon polygamy involved a few generations back too, right?
But then my wife is working for a photography company. She's district manager, and they want to move her to Louisiana as a promotion. We said, okay, we'll do that.
Is that a promotion?
Louisiana, I don't know.
That was probably the best line there. Louisiana as a promotion. Isn't that an oxymoron? Ian picked up on it.
But she moved to Baton Rouge. We had agreed we would meet in Shreveport once a month, and it was going to be fine.
Yeah.
I wanted her to live her dream. It was promotion, right? She was there for several months, and they said, we're going to close that district. We want to move you to Baltimore. Right? So we talked about it. I said, fine, I'll come visit you for 3 months. We'll go see Washington, D.C. We'll do stuff. So I called Mike, my friend Mike, right, of the bulletin board fame. And I said, Mike, I need you to pray. We need Susan to get this position in Baltimore. It's a 2-week vetting deal, but, please pray for her. And Mike said, absolutely, I'll put him in the temple, which Mike had done for 20 years for me. And I said, however, Mike, this is where I got really crafty. I said, if God wants me to be LDS again, he will send Susan to Salt Lake. There was no position open in Salt Lake, and I knew that. The very next day, the person in Salt Lake retires. The very next day, Susan's paperwork is transferred to from Baltimore to Salt Lake, and she's hired without any vetting immediately. So I'll call Mike, and I said, Mike, you're not going to believe this, but Susan's going to Salt Lake. And Mike said, you told God. I said, I was just joking. He said, God wasn't. That's when I decided it was time to hit my knees. And I said, okay, Heavenly Father, you want me to be LDS again? Great. But I have issues. There's issues that I left the church over. Those have never been resolved. I need you to resolve these issues. And I left it in his hands. And then for the next several weeks, I would wake up in the middle of the night with a new answer. Every night. Well, not every night, but almost every night. With some new answer. For example, I told you that geography was one of my issues, right? Archaeology. And so I'm sitting talking to the Lord, and the Lord says, okay, if you walk the streets of Jerusalem, does that make the Bible true? And I said, no. And he said, but if tomorrow someone found a sign down in South America or somewhere and they wipe it off and it says, welcome to Zarahemla, population 450, what would that do? I said it would make the Book of Mormon.
Well, we would know that population 450 would disprove the whole Book of Mormon right there. I think this is an interesting point here for a couple of reasons. We see Christians arguing with Mormon apologists on the internet regarding this sort of thing. The Christians will say, well, you Mormons don't have really any archaeological evidence of these people ever existing, which is a good point. And then they'll go and say, but, the Bible, of course, we've got all sorts of things that verify the Bible. And this guy does make a good point here in that just because Jerusalem's there doesn't mean some guy named Jesus, was born to some Jews who named their child Jesus, and he did all those things that it says that he did and was resurrected, and all these people knew about it, but there isn't one historian that noticed him, unless you count Josephus, which is really a stretch. So just because someplace exists doesn't make something true. And just because someone comes up with some knowledge that they needed supernatural means to come up with doesn't mean that the theology is true that you're promoting in that case. In other words, saying, well, if I can tell the future, then if I prophesy something, then whatever religion I am preaching or ascribe is true is the truth, and so therefore, Joseph Smith is a prophet, or Jesus is the savior of the world, or Buddha is the divine guide, or whatever it is. Just because I do some remote viewing or prophesy something correctly, or name a city that someone else doesn't know of, if I am given knowledge through other means, does that mean an entire theology is true? That is a logical fallacy. That's ridiculous. But this guy's going to lead us into going along with a line of reasoning that actually doesn't make sense.
Well, absolutely true. And he said, well, then what would be your faith? And I was, okay, that's an answer I can accept. One of my issues.
Another thing is, faith is promoted as being some sort of necessary virtue. We had to come to earth to live by faith. And faith is basically the ability to believe in things that don't make any sense, or to believe things, especially that have evidence that against them being true. It's like a virtue to be gullible. The more ridiculous something is, the greater your faith must be to believe it, and that is extolled as a virtue, which is an excellent circular reasoning and mind control trap. There's nothing virtuous about being gullible. It's stupidity, actually.
This was Joseph Smith. First, it was the one where he was a treasure hunter, a kid. Folklore.
Yeah. You know what the Lord told me?
Folklore? Okay, he practiced magic. They call it folk magic, and now it's folklore. That moves it even more into an, innocuous sounding thing. But this guy was practicing magic, sacrificing animals, murdering animals, making them, exhaust themselves, dripping the blood out of their throats around a magic circle in order to appease a demon guarding treasure. And we're going to call that folklore? It's an interesting and useful manipulation if you want to make it not sound evil. Also, we know that not only the Bible, but the Book of Mormon condemns practicing magic and or witchcraft. We are told there was much magic and witchcraft in the land in the Book of Mormon when everything seemed to be going wrong. Yet, it's okay for Joseph Smith to be practicing magic and or witchcraft.
He said, okay, Mr. Attorney, who would you have chosen? Would it have been you, who questions everything? Would it have been a doctor, perhaps, who would have been more your liking, who always needs to have proof and evidence of something to fix something? Or, how about my plan, where it's a person who's open to the suggestion that there's other stuff out there, that there's the potential that God will talk to you, that God will be there, that you'll have visitations from angels. Who would you have chosen, Mr. Attorney, since you're so smart? And I said, Joseph Smith, sir.
Very effective. So, it was better for Joseph Smith to be called of God because he was open to other things. However, like I was just saying, the so-called scriptures, the Hebrew Bible and the Book of Mormon, both condemn witchcraft and the practice of magic. We're told that if we don't keep the word of wisdom, we won't be in the celestial kingdom. Not because coffee is such a terrible sin, but because disobedience is. For Joseph Smith to be a magician, he has to be outright rebelling against God as far as the Bible is concerned. It talks about wizards and sorcerers as, way down the list from being good. These are abominations. That's like false religion. It's in the realm of devil worship. Now we saw what Elijah did to the priests of Baal. He murdered them. We saw that God had Joshua and Moses lead the people to go murder those who worshipped other gods. In fact, those that didn't even worship other gods but just picked up a few sticks on the Sabbath day to keep their children warm or cook the food were murdered as a group activity among the Israelite cult. Okay, so that's what it says in the books of Moses. They had to kill these people for not worshiping Yahweh hard enough on the Sabbath day. Yet, Joseph Smith can be open to other things such as, witchcraft, magic, devil worship, that sort of a thing, demonology. I mean, he's making sacrifices to demons. How is that not as bad as making sacrifices to Baal? In which case, he should have been killed, according to what God had to say in the Old Testament. Has God just mellowed out? I thought he was unchangeable.
But that was an answer that I could understand. But the one about the this is kind of funny because I'd always heard the.
And because you can understand it or relate to it, that makes it right. Then, right, Wally or whatever your name was, Dusty. Just because you relate to it doesn't reconcile it to what we have in the scriptures, and that I would say is a problem. It's a legalistic problem, and as a lawyer, legalistic should be something you're familiar with. Then again, so should rationalizing be, and twisting things to make them appear a little different to win the approval of your audience in the jury.
Answers, well, he told different things to different people at different times. Yeah. So something happened during the day, and Susan was living here. I was still living in Dallas, and something had happened. I don't remember what the story was, but I wanted to relate the story to Susan. So I'm telling Susan the story, and I've already told it a couple of times to friends during the day, but I'm telling Susan, I'm cutting some things out because I feel like she doesn't need to know the superfluous stuff, right? And she's interrupting me all to ask questions, and I hate being interrupted. Keep that in mind. Anyway, sorry.
Guy's such a jerk. All right. As much as I dislike Kwaku, I almost felt sorry for him there. So the guy's not telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth here to his wife, and he wonders why it's a problem.
So finally I get mad at her for interrupting me because she's asking me questions. And she finally says, if you tell me everything, I wouldn't have to ask you questions. And then I realized you do tell people different stories based on who they are and what you think they already know.
Wonderful use of a false paradigm there. Okay, once again, Joseph Smith contradicted himself. That's the problem. That's why you win in court when you catch people contradicting themselves, because you prove that they are liars. Okay? Now, in this instance, you're saying that you just weren't telling the whole truth, and because you did that, it's okay for Joseph Smith to do that too. Sorry, that doesn't change the fact that he controverted and contradicted himself. Okay? He changed things over and over. He is a liar. He broke his covenants with his wife and pretended God commanded him to do that, while he stated that we believe in honoring, sustaining, and obeying the law. Also, Section 132 says that, marriage for time still needs to be honored for time, and it's a covenant until death do you part. However, Joseph Smith was not keeping that covenant of marital exclusivity with his wife. He was trampling on the covenant that he made to cleave unto her and none else. So none of these little bits of fancy talk actually change anything. The problem is Jesus Christ contradicts himself in the LDS scriptures. We don't have a story that is congruent. We have inconsistency with the rules of the story. We have a God that lies but says that he doesn't. We have prophets that lie but say we shouldn't. We have prophets that commit adultery and say that God told them to do it. That's a problem. We have a prophet that tells us that he translated a book by the gift and power of God and that it was correct and that Jesus said it was correct and required thousands of corrections after it and is still filled with contradiction and things that are anachronisms and impossible. We have another book called the Book of Abraham, which Joseph Smith said was written by the hand of Abraham. But we know that he lied about that because the papyrus don't translate to anything like what he said. So the church changes its story, or the brethren change the story and say, no, Joseph just got inspired by this completely unrelated funerary text, which was not written in the time of Abraham and referred to documents that were written thousands of years after Abraham would have lived, as being associated with Abraham and his situation 2,000 years previous. In other words, absolute and totally, incontrovertible evidence that he manufactured the entire story, that it's an absolute lie. Yet, we're supposed to just pray about it and feel like it's okay. And even in that case, we find that the very text is filled with scientific impossibilities, with historic lies, and with anachronisms both in history and in linguistics. The person who wrote the Book of Abraham may have been imaginative. They also copied things out of the Bible that were anachronistic, and they added all sorts of idiotic things that were absolutely provably false. Something an all-knowing and wise and unchanging God, which we're supposed to believe this God of Israel is, obviously could not do. So all this fancy talk still doesn't mean jack squat, but these guys are here to make us feel good about it, that this man who was prideful was brought back into the fold by a loving heavenly Father who was patient enough to work through other individuals to conquer his pride and arrogance and bring him back through some miracles. And then these ridiculous stories that, well, I mean these rationalizations and these false premises he's using to make it sound like just because he can relate to something that a lawyer does in withholding complete testimony or something, that makes it okay for Joseph Smith to lie. And of course he doesn't say that he lies, he just says that he didn't quite tell the entire story. It's a difference between being incomplete in a story and actually contradicting yourself.
And that was a hard way to learn that lesson because we had to fight. But it did dawn on me, yeah, you might change the story a little bit. Not change it, but alter it to focus on different things. Yeah, or less depth, depending on who you're talking. Yeah. So these were some of the answers that I was waking up with in the middle of the night. And I would go back to, I'd write it down and go back to bed. And then one day I woke up and I hit my knees to pray, as I did every morning, and I realized my testimony was back. And I had I don't want to make it sound like I'm a visionary because I'm not, but I had like this scene in my head where Heavenly Father the Lord walks up to me and he's got his hands like this. And he walks up to me and he says, okay, I have kept this safe and warm for you. Now it's your turn to keep it. This time, take care of it. And he touches my chest. My testimony's back. And for the first time in my life, it dawned on me.
Did you see that little light hit Ian when he did that?
I was at LDS the first time. It was like testimony was like an iCloud. You pulled it down when you needed it. I'm going to give a testimony. I'm going to pull it down, give a testimony, put it back up there. And it occurred to me that your testimony is a living, breathing thing. And if you're not nourishing it, taking care of it, and feeding it, then it will die.
Really? It's a thing? And so he's manipulated by spiritual involvement in his life by whoever or whatever, but none of these things change the fact that we have absolute contradiction and lies and deliberate deceit by Joseph Smith. He deceived his wife. He deceived everybody in the church except those who were basically his confidants that he was dragging down to completely immoral behavior. We have Brigham Young doing it, and we have their successors continuing to do it today, and we see absolutely deliberate deception being practiced on LDS.org in the Gospel Topics essays and elsewhere. So, I'm sorry, but this is very clever, and they act good-humored and all that sort of a thing, but it doesn't make any of it true. And it's not supposed to work that way either. What we're told in the Book of Mormon is if someone has hardened their heart, if they once had the truth, that they will never come back. That's what we're told, that the Amalekites, they had once had the gospel, so once they left, they were done. Their hearts were hardened. God wasn't going to have anything to do with them, and then they just went and helped the Lamanites start wars against the Nephites because they were the most hardened of people. Yet he's not. He's violating the rules for spiritual law that we have taught to us in the Book of Mormon. And he's able to be friendly with these people when he's anti-Mormon. He didn't say, oh, I went out and did the kind of things in the Book of Mormon. Boy, if he left the church, he'd be, doing everything wrong. He'd be running a prostitution ring or something, and he'd be a gadiant and robber. And no, he managed to still be a decent guy, but he was angry at the church. He couldn't seem to come up with any good reasons why. But it was all about his attitude and his pride and his anger, because he got deceived when he was out on 3 hours sleep, and these anti-Mormons deceived him. And then he studied things and realized he really didn't give us a good reason to tell us why it was okay for the church to leave out important details, or he didn't mention that the church actually lied about its history either. He very cleverly avoided a lot of the things that someone who would leave the church would probably describe if they were doing a good job of enumerating the lies and conflicts that we find in LDS doctrine and the fact that it has changed so much. So if we look at this carefully, we don't have to get caught in the fuzzy feel-good, hey, he's a nice guy, and so God brought him back into the church business. Like I said, once again, as far as the Book of Mormon is concerned, if you leave the church, all you want to do is do terrible, wicked, awful things. But that's not normally what we see. We do see people that decide they want to drink some alcohol and that sort of a thing, but maybe it's partially a newfound freedom after being mind-controlled so hard. But are they out wanting to do harm to people generally? No, that's probably not what the case generally tends to be. So people are falsely characterized, and that's what we find in the allusions to anti-Mormons or apostates. Traitors and tyrants now fight him in vain. Persecuted Joseph Smith. They're left to kick against the pricks, to persecute the saints, and to fight against God, because Satan has all power over them. Except in this guy's case, he's even a lawyer, but God brings him back because, well, he's special, I guess. I'm all done with this guy. Box him up.